On May 10, 1996, Yasuko Namba stood on the summit of Mount Everest. At 47 years old, she had just achieved her lifelong dream to complete the seven summits and become the oldest Japanese woman to stand on the roof of the world. But her triumph was short-lived. Hours later, as a violent storm swept across the mountain, Yasuko collapsed in the death zone along with several other climbers. Exhausted, frostbitten, and blinded by snow, she was unable to continue. Rescue attempts were made, but when night fell, Yasuko Namba was left lying in the snow, still alive, but too weak to move. Other climbers staggered back to camp. Yasuko did not. By the following morning, she had frozen to death just a few hundred meters from safety. Her death became one of the most haunting tragedies of the 1996 Everest disaster, which claimed 8 lives in a single storm. But Yasuko's story stands out for a painful reason. She was abandoned while still breathing. The question that lingers nearly 3 decades later is simple, but brutal. Why? Why was Yasuko Namba left behind on Everest? To understand Yasuko Namba's fate on Everest, we need to know who she was, not just how she died, but how she lived. Born in 1949, Yasuko grew up in Japan during a period of rapid social and economic change. She built a successful career as an executive at a major trading company in Tokyo. By all accounts, she was disciplined, ambitious, and deeply respected by her colleagues. But beyond the boardrooms of corporate Japan, Yasuko carried a passion that defined her. Mountaineering. In her 40s, she dedicated herself to the challenge of the seven summits, the tallest peak on each continent. It was an extraordinary ambition, especially for a woman in Japan at that time, when few pursued extreme adventure at such a high level. But Yasuko was relentless. She climbed Kilimanjaro, Elbrus, Denali, Aconcagua, and Vinson. In 1993, she summited Everest's rival, Mount McKinley, and by 1996, Everest was the final peak standing between her and the completion of her dream. Friends described her as quiet but determined, modest but fiercely strong-willed. To her, Everest was not just about fame. It was about proving to herself and perhaps to the world that age, gender, and convention did not define her limits. On May 10, 1996, when she stepped onto the top of Everest, Yasuko achieved that dream. But in the death zone, triumph and tragedy often walk side by side. Hours later, the same ambition that had carried her to the summit would leave her vulnerable to the storm that claimed her life. The spring of 1996 began like so many others on Everest, crowded, ambitious, and filled with optimism. Commercial guiding companies had transformed the mountain into a global stage. For tens of thousands of dollars, clients could be led to the top of the world by seasoned guides. Two of the most prominent teams that year were led by Rob Hall of Adventure Consultants and Scott Fisher of Mountain Madness. Their groups included climbers from around the world, including Yasuko Namba. Hall's company in particular was known for its strict discipline and high success rate, but the season carried hidden dangers. May 10th was chosen a summit day for multiple teams, creating a bottleneck on the upper mountain. Dozens of climbers funneled toward the Hillary Step and the South Summit, waiting for ropes to be fixed. Hours were lost in the death zone, where oxygen is scarce and every minute eats away at the body. By the time climbers reached the top, it was already dangerously late in the afternoon. Yasuko Namba reached the summit after 3:00 p.m., well past the recommended turnaround time of 2:00 p.m. The skies were still clear, but on Everest, weather can change in moments. And on this day, it did. As climbers began their descent, a storm slammed into the mountain. Winds held at hurricane force, and whiteout conditions blinded the climbers. Visibility shrank to nothing. Temperatures plummeted to minus 40 degrees C. Exhausted, frostbitten, and disoriented, many climbers lost their way in the blizzard. Ropes were buried under snow, trail markers disappeared, and even experienced guides struggled to navigate. At night, 8 climbers would die in the storm. Some froze in place. Others simply vanished into the whiteout. Among them was Yasuko Namba, who was caught high on the mountain, unable to descend. The 1996 disaster became the deadliest Everest tragedy at the time and later immortalized in John Krakauer's Into Thin Air. But within this larger catastrophe, Yasuko's story stands apart because she was left behind while still alive. For Yasuko Namba, May 10th, 1996 began with hope. After weeks of acclimatization and preparation, she finally had her chance to reach the top of Everest. The skies were clear, the winds calm, and she was determined to complete the 7 summits. But even at the start, the climb was plagued with delays. Too many climbers pushed for the summit at once. Bottlenecks formed at the Hillary Step and other narrow passages where only one climber could move at a time. Fixing ropes took longer than expected, forcing climbers to wait precious hours in the death zone. By the time Yasuko reached the South Summit, her pace had slowed. She was exhausted, but she pressed forward. Finally, after 3:00 p.m. well past the safe turnaround time, she stepped onto the summit of Everest. She was overjoyed. Witnesses recall her raising a small Japanese flag, tears in her eyes, pride etched across her frostbitten face. At that moment, Yasuko had achieved what she set out to do. She became the oldest Japanese woman to stand on the highest point on Earth. For her, it was victory, but the summit is only half the journey. And on Everest, it's often the descent that kills. The late Airman Yasuko and many others were descending in fading light. Clouds rolled in, and the wind began to rise. As they moved down toward the south col, the mountain unleashed its fury. A blizzard swallowed the upper slopes, erasing all visibility. Climbers became separated, wandering aimlessly in the whiteout. Yasuko, already exhausted, began to falter. Her summit dream had been realized, but now her body was failing her. Step by step, she slipped closer to the line between triumph and tragedy. She would not make it back to camp that night. As night fell on May 10th, the mountain transformed into chaos. The storm that roared across the upper slopes of Everest turned the descent into a desperate fight for survival. Winds lashed at over 70 miles per hour, and temperatures plunged far below freezing. For Yasuko Namba, the summit euphoria had already faded into exhaustion. Her movement slowed, her balance faltered, and the blizzard stripped away what little strength remained. Alongside her was Beck Weathers, an American climber who had gone blind from severe altitude-related complications. Both were now dependent on their teammates and guides. A group of climbers, including Yasuko, Beck, and several others, became disoriented in the storm. Unable to find the fixed ropes or locate Camp Roman 4 at the South Col, they huddled together in the snow, waiting for daylight. By dawn, rescuers from other expeditions stumbled upon them. Yasuko was barely conscious, her body stiff with frostbite. Beck Weathers appeared comatose, his skin blackened by the cold. The rescuers faced an impossible decision. Most of the group could still walk with help, but Yasuko and Beck could not. They tried to revive Yasuko, shouting her name, pulling her arms, begging her to move, but she remained slumped in the snow, fading further with every passing minute. Beck, too, seemed beyond hope. The rescuers faced a brutal reality. They did not have the strength, oxygen, or manpower to carry multiple incapacitated climbers down through the death zone. With heavy hearts, they made the decision no mountaineer ever wants to make. They left Yasuko and Beck behind, assuming both were already as good as dead. As the group staggered toward Camp Roman 4, Yasuko Namba lay still on the south col, only a few hundred meters from safety. She was alive, but she had been abandoned to the storm. By nightfall, she would not rise again. The decision to leave Yasuko Namba on Everest was not made lightly. But in the death zone, where every breath is borrowed time, climbers are often forced into choices that defy human instinct. By the morning of May 11th, Yasuko was unresponsive, severely frostbitten, and unable to walk. Rescuers from other expeditions, including guides from adventure consultants, attempted to rouse her, but nothing worked. To move her would have required a coordinated team of strong climbers, each risking their own survival in the storm. In that moment, the math was brutal. Carrying Yasuko down could have doomed everyone. Guides concluded that she could not survive the descent. Exhausted and oxygen-deprived themselves, they made the decision to leave her behind. She was placed in the snow alongside Beck Weathers, who was also presumed dead. But here lies the painful irony. Beck Weathers somehow awoke hours later, stumbling blindly back toward camp in one of the most miraculous survivals in mountaineering history. Yasuko, however, did not. So why was she left behind? Because in that storm, rescuers believed she was beyond saving. Because on Everest, the line between life and death is thin, and mistakes and judgment are inevitable. It doesn't make the decision less tragic. Yasuko Namba was left alive on Everest because rescuers simply could not carry her, and because in the death zone, survival is often a cruel calculation. When the full story of the 1996 Everest disaster emerged, Yasuko Namba's death became one of its most painful and controversial elements. Unlike others who perished high on the mountain, she had been left behind while still breathing. Her fate sparked a wave of questions that continue to haunt the climbing community. Should more have been done to save her? Were the guides wrong to abandon her? Or was her death an unavoidable outcome of the deadly storm? Critics pointed to the growing commercialization of Everest. Yasuko was a paying client, part of a system where climbers with limited high-altitude experience were led into extreme environments. When disaster struck, many asked, were these climbers truly prepared for what Everest demands? And did commercial guides put profit and summit success ahead of safety? Supporters of the rescuers defended their actions. In the death zone, they argued, physics and physiology leave little room for compassion. Carrying a motionless climber at 8,000 meters is almost impossible. Even the strongest mountaineers collapse under the strain. To attempt a full rescue might have doomed everyone involved. Yasuko's story also raised the issue of gender and perception. Some Japanese media suggested that because she was a middle-aged woman, she was underestimated, her suffering overlooked. Others pushed back, saying the storm was so overwhelming that identity played no role, it was simply survival. What is clear is that her death became a symbol of the moral dilemmas Everest forces on those who climb it. On the highest mountain in the world, the rules of humanity clash with the laws of nature, and sometimes, even when someone is still alive, the mountain demands they be left behind. Yasuko Namba's death was not just a personal tragedy, it became a global debate about ambition, responsibility, and the true cost of climbing Everest. Yasuko Namba's story is both inspiring and heartbreaking. She was a woman who defied expectations, who balanced a demanding corporate career with a passion for climbing, and who came within reach of completing the seven summits. Her determination carried her to the top of Everest, the highest point on Earth, but her final hours remind us of the brutal truth of high-altitude mountaineering. On Everest, dreams and lives can vanish in an instant. Yasuko was left behind not because she was forgotten, but because the mountain left no room for mercy. Survival in the death zone demands impossible choices, and in 1996, those choices sealed her fate. Her death continues to raise difficult questions about ambition, responsibility, and the commercialization of Everest. Should she have been guided differently? Could she have been saved? Or was the storm simply too powerful for anyone to survive? What is certain is that Yasuko Namba's courage lives on. She is remembered not only as a victim of the 1996 disaster, but as a pioneer who pursued her dream with extraordinary determination. On Everest, the summit is never guaranteed, and Yasuko's story is a reminder that sometimes reaching the top is only half the journey.